Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We have 2 minutes, 1 minute, now 1 minute to start the session. So you could now scan the QR code in front of you. So you just have a view of who's in the room, and you get to know who's beside you. And the speakers would have a better idea who they are talking to, so better contextualize the presentation. So I'll go back to the QR code. So you could join us here at Mentimeter. So you have to have of course, your net connected to Hilton Honors 888-888 for the conference code. Then the QR code will lead you to the Mentimeter with a set of questions. Is everyone here? Okay. You could also join using the code 75346821 if you are joining directly in the web.
Do you think it's okay to give them a few more minutes? Ano yung nakatakip ng QR code? IFI.
You could proceed to the next question. What do you hope to gain from this panel discussion? So proceed next after answering which type of organization do you represent. So now we have financial institution leading with 5 people here in the room. So your next question, only one has answered. So maybe others could also join. Really, does it do the next?
Good afternoon, everyone. I see a couple of colleagues still coming in. Maybe we can give them a minute and then we will start. For those who just joined, we have a Mentimeter poll ongoing right now. So maybe, Sherry, you can share the QR code again. So for those who just joined, if you could scan this QR code so we know a little bit about you while we go forward with the panel session. So Sherry, maybe you can share the results for now. All right. So here is the composition of today's panel session. So it's a good mix of colleagues from international financial institutions, government agencies, international organizations, non-government organizations, and we have someone from an academic or research institution. Thanks so much for being here. I can also see that some of you have filled out that question on what do you hope to gain from this panel discussion. So it seems like, yes, there's a couple of people who want to learn about the best practices of Asian Development Fund projects. All right, so let's proceed. I'm Nassreena Baddiri. I'm the moderator for today's panel session. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. And this session entitled Catalyzing Progress, Leveraging Concessional Finance for Development in Asia and the Pacific. So Sherry, please go ahead with the PowerPoint. Okay, let's give her a minute. Yes. Okay, next slide. All right, next slide. So for this session, we'll look at the role of concessional finance, particularly grants, in supporting vulnerable DMCs, such as fragile and conflict-affected situations and small island developing states. For those of you who are not so familiar with concessional finance refers to financial assistance provided by most MDBs, multilateral development banks, through grants and concessional loans designed to support development of the most vulnerable countries to address poverty, to provide infrastructure needs, as well as to help with resilience to global challenges. So this session, we will discuss opportunities for leveraging concessional finance, specifically grants, through the Asian Development Fund to address intersecting challenges such as climate change. We will also look at best practices and lessons learned from ADF grant financing in Asia and the Pacific. And last but not the least, we'll explore future strategies to ensure effectiveness of ADF grants. So just a brief background to the Asian Development Fund. The fund was established in 1974 as a source of low-interest loans for ADB's poorest member countries. And since then, it has contributed significantly to poverty reduction in Asia and the Pacific region. IED evaluates the ADF every 4 years in time to inform the succeeding replenishment of the Asian Development Fund. ADF was converted to a concessional loan and grant facility in 2005, and in 2017 it became a grant-only facility after the transfer of ADF's concessional loan portfolio to ADB's Ordinary Capital Resources, or OCR, balance sheet. The ADF operates, go back please. The ADF operates in a context where the risk of having poverty gains can be reversed in the medium term due to development challenges that most vulnerable DMCs are facing. And without accelerated efforts to address these new challenges, the region is unlikely to achieve the SDG goals by 2030. Okay, next slide. So IED's 2023 evaluation of ADF has found that ADF is reaching poor and vulnerable countries. ADF grant recipients are among the world's poorest and most vulnerable, facing exceptional development challenges. And in a time of polycrisis, ADF has served as a crucial safety net. For ADF 13, the fund includes theme-based components as well, which support priority development objectives that are aligned with ADB's Strategy 2030 and provides financing for underinvested projects. So for ADF 13, we have the thematic window, which includes climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction, regional cooperation and integration, including regional public goods, SDG 5, transformative gender. At the same time, there's also a private sector window and a disaster and pandemic response facility. Later on, we'll hear from Eric as well in terms of how the new ADF 14 has been designed. ADF also has been a valuable tool enabling rapid response to crises while maintaining a focus on long-term development. And so we've seen this demonstrated particularly in its emergency interventions in Afghanistan, as well as Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. Okay. So in terms of key messages from IED's 2023 evaluation of ADF, we see that grant financing that is available to Group B countries that is categorized by ADB as Group B countries has been relatively small despite their need. So there's really a need to increase allocation of thematic resources and expand access of those countries as well. In terms of allocation mechanisms, the country allocation framework must be refined to prioritize countries with the greatest need. And that includes ensuring stability and predictability of support. In terms of M&E, we also see some gaps in terms of measurement outcomes, and there's really a need for a more robust M&E framework tailored to the specific context of FCAS and SIDS to improve adaptive learning and project performance. The evaluation also found that given the unique challenges in countries such as limited resources and high vulnerability to external shocks, capacity building initiatives must be tailored to their specific needs. And we'll also hear from the panelists later on about the work that they're doing here. In terms of collaboration and coordination, that is really an important aspect when it comes to working in ADF-eligible countries. Better coordination is essential to maximize the impact of development assistance. One example is, for example, the coordination of partners for the Sustaining Essential Services Delivery project for Afghanistan. Last but not the least, integrating efforts in disaster response is also, and climate adaptation is important. And so the evaluation has noted that there really needs to be a holistic approach when it comes to CCA and DRR, particularly for small island developing states. So as I mentioned earlier, IED evaluates ADF in time to inform the next ADF replenishment. And that's really to make sure that the findings and recommendations of the evaluation can be used by ADB in terms of designing the next ADF iteration. And as we can see, ADB has utilized some of the evaluation lessons in ADF 14, and we'll hear about it later on as well. One of the lessons that were included in ADF 14 was the introduction of a performance-based component in the resource allocation in ADF 14, particularly in the economic vulnerability premium. And that is to enhance the allocation framework of ADF. Second, there was preferential access given to the thematic pool, particularly for countries with limited capacity, specifically for those in ADB Group A and B, fragile conflict-affected states and small island developing states, with an important increase in the cap as well for Group B countries. For ADF 14, there's now an enhanced crisis response window to leverage ADB's comparative advantage, particularly in terms of ex-ante financing and instruments. Also, I can see from ADF 14 that there's also now a important focus on M&E systems. And so ADB is developing an ADF results framework, drawing from ADB's corporate results framework, which is also now being updated and refined. Right. Okay. So for today's panel, this is our format. We'll have what we call lightning talks. So these are focus panel segments from our speakers this afternoon. And then we'll have a thematic discussion as well right after. And this will be divided into 2 blocks. And we'll have an opportunity towards the end to hear from you. If you have any questions, comments as well that you'd like to share with the rest of this panel, we'll be very happy to hear from you. Right. So here is a list of our session speakers. If you haven't seen it already, we're very happy to be joined by Deputy Secretary Asal Liauma from the Ministry of Finance of Tuvalu. We also have Executive Director Madi Arya Wijaya from the Asian Development Bank. We have Wendy Walker, Director of Human and Social Development as well from the Asian Development Bank. We have Rosalind Mackenzie, Principal Operations Specialist from the Fragility and Engagement Division of the Asian Development Bank. And we have Eric Alberts, Principal Planning and Policy Economist from the Strategic Policy and Partnerships Department of the Asian Development Bank. All right. So I turn over the microphone and the floor to Deputy Secretary for your segment.
Thank you, Nassreena. Well, actually, also like to thank ADB for arranging this panel discussion, especially in having us, Tuvalu, which is one of the very small countries in the Pacific, to be part of this panel discussion. Well, before I start my presentation on concessional financing and how Tuvalu has been benefited from ADF financing, I just would like to pose a question whether, is there anyone in the room, apart from my colleagues from Tonga and Samoa, who knows where Tuvalu is? Thank you. Yeah, of course, if you try looking up into the world map, you will not able to find Tuvalu. It's just not a tiny dot as well. For your information, well, Tuvalu is a very small island developing state in the Pacific, comprising of 4 coral and 5 pure atoll islands. So, with a land area of just 26 square kilometers, our population is approximately 11,000 people, with a real GDP of 39.6 million. We are very small. So it is, Tuvalu is geographically located on the north of Fiji and northeast of Australia. So it is geographically isolated and highly vulnerable to climatic and economic shocks. Our national income is predominantly derived from fishing licenses, which is approximately more than 50% of our national revenue, as well as our trust fund investments, assistance from our development partners, our .tv, and as well as remittances. With a very small private sector in Tuvalu and limited resources, the public sector is mainly the driver for growth. Disasters triggered by natural disasters, natural hazards, and increase the country's economic volatility and can substantially alter physical outcomes, fiscal risk. Next slide, please. So ADB assistance to Tuvalu includes improving our maritime facilities, strengthening of disaster resilience, advancing renewable energy, improving water and sanitation, promoting health as well, and sustaining prudent fiscal management. This has led to the increase in infrastructure developments and increase in growth in Tuvalu. In terms of concessional finances, given the financial challenges that I have highlighted earlier, as a developing country, our government is faced with high expenses, high level of government expenditures. Given also the volatility in the main source of revenue that we have, which is fishing licenses as a result of climate change, we are faced with a limited physical space that are readily available for capital developments. So that is where concessional financing and ADF assistance is really in need for us back home. In terms of climate resilience and adaptation projects, ADB also assists us with the financing of our developments. So this is what we would like ADB to push out to ADB. In terms of concessional grants, we want it more flexible and accessible, specifically tailored to our needs for Tuvalu. The one-size-fits-all cliche, we see it does not fit. We have our specific and unique challenges that we face. And finally, up to be upscaled. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary. Now I turn over the floor to Executive Director Madhi Vijaya.
Yeah, thank you, Nesh. So before I share my lesson learned experience in the board, maybe I explain a little bit. So now, if maybe a colleague from the outside the ADB, ADB until now we have 68 members countries and divided into 12 suites. So now I'm in the as the executive director for Suite 5. So we have 9 member constituents. Like my colleague, Edie Justin, is also executive director for Suite 2. She has 7, right? It's 7 countries as a constituent. So, and then if we look at what our roles as the as a board members, actually, if you look at the mandate, our main role is how we conducting supervision for the operation of the ADB as a general. So of course, in this context, many aspects we have to discuss with the management. One of them, of course, in the evaluation and the monitoring and the evaluation. So that's why, and the other thing also, since last year I joined the ADB and now as the members of the DEC committee, so Development Effectiveness Committee. So Yasin is my chair, so I'm coach, vice chair. I think this event is very relevant with our role in conducting the evaluation for the ADB operation. Okay, let's see. So I have one slide to express what our lesson learned in Suite 5 perspective. In terms of the what our member constituencies now, based on the country classification, so we have 3 members. Group A, this is have the fully access for the grants, and then there are 3 also for the Group B. This is limited access for grants, but have a fully concessional loan, and the last group, the Group C, is fully for the OCR. So there is no grant access. So that's why if you look at the characteristic, so we are in the Suite 5 of the diversity. We have both as a donors for ADF and also the recipient. But majority can access because the 6 of the 9 can access for the ADF grant, even for the Group B is a limited access. And the second aspect, why SADF grant so important? So if we look at the experience so far, the ADF grant has proven to provide funding for critical infrastructure development, achieving major macroeconomic and fiscal reform, and supporting economic recovery, and also the public sector and governance reforms. It will include, of course, the natural disaster or the global conflict. So I think many now from the governors in the Pacific acknowledge, so the support from the ADB is very, very useful and very, very helpful. So that's why, but if you look at more deeper, so why grant is so important for the seeds, especially in the Pacific, at least what my observation, there are 4 main reasons. The first one, the seed mostly is the limited fiscal space, as the DPOE mentioned, because the seed mostly is small countries, small economy, and there's also small the fiscal capacity. And the second one, the seed in the Pacific also facing the climate change existence of the threat. So like in the Pacific last year, I'm visiting my constituent to Fiji and Samoa. During the September until April, this is the cyclone season. So this is the climate change threat every year facing the Pacific. So our seed in the Pacific. And also the other thing is related with the cost or price issue. So now our experience, if we build some project in the Pacific, the cost is maybe 2 or 3 times higher than the other region. For example, like last year, the Kuala Tonga built a new port, so some of the materials should be imported from Japan. So that's why the cost is very expensive. And the last one, also the reason is regarding the labor issue. So now in this seed, this is very lack, we have a skilled labor, while they have a skill and then they migrate. So last year, in the statistic, calling from Fiji, they migrate at least 60,000 to Australia and New Zealand because they get payment more, better than if they work in the Fiji. So this is the second thing I want to share. And the last one, of course, the aspect from the Group B, especially Group B countries, they have limited access to ADF grants, but they have fully access to concessional loan. So last year, we agree in the board, of course, it's approved by the all ADF donors, for the Group B countries, now we apply the softer terms for the seeds. So the softer term is the interest rate only 1%, the maturity, the tenure is 40 years, and the grace period 10 years. So this is the soft term for the seed. So that's why for the Group B countries, even the limited access for the grant, but for the concessional loan is very helpful to support the development. I stop here. Thank you. Thank you, Nes.
Thank you so much, Edie Maddy. Now let's have Wendy Walker share with us her insights and perspectives.
Okay, thank you, Nash. It's good to be in this part after these two kind of overarching visions, and I want to focus a little bit on ADF as an opportunity to really strengthen human capital and social development. You can go to the first slide, please. What we see so far is that while many of the projects do have a focus on poverty reduction writ large, on addressing Sustainable Development Goal 1, in actuality, not that many are really focusing on human development areas of health and education sectors. 12 out of the last 149, I think it says, projects focused on that, and 24 have elements of social protection in them. So the majority of those social development, the social protection focused projects really came through the COVID response programming, where social protection was a strong pillar along with health and broader public management assistance. So it appears to be a kind of limited use of ADF to date in terms of creating human capital and social development in projects. But I think that that's not an entirely fair assessment. There is the gender thematic pool, and it's through there that a lot of very important work is done on the transformative gender agenda now going forward especially. But that has a very strong focus, obviously, on women and girls and children. What we're really missing is a broader focus on other types of vulnerable groups, like youth, like persons with disabilities, like older persons, migrants, informal workers, etc. So there's a chance here to actually strengthen going forward, not only in terms of developing new thematic pool, but also in strengthening the way that we go about using the thematic pools that we actually have. So the engagement that we had during COVID obviously has been opening up a lot of new avenues, and one really good one is in terms of social protection. That initial assistance is inspiring countries to be able to start developing the pipeline in that area. And this is really important for future resilience, very well related to all the climate issues Edie just spoke about. And beyond. It's going to be vital to addressing many of the polycrises that Nash talked about in terms of technology, but also changes in terms of technology, demographic changes, and climate changes. The IED report underlined a couple of different interesting findings for the human development, social development side of things. One is that it has made the case over and over again that there needs to be a stronger focus on the social sectors. Without that investment, we will not get inclusive and sustainable growth going forward. And secondly, the need for better baselines and impact studies, which gives a strong focus on data and information, and that there are opportunities to strengthen the thematic pools by adding greater flexibility, and also flexibility in how people interpret even the guidelines that are there. So the next slide then gives you a kind of sense about what's coming down the pike and what has already started emerging in ADB. I think this is a very exciting project developed in Tonga last year, which is an integrated aged care project. It did many of the things which I think many people are calling for. It brought together different sources of concessional financing, not just the ADF, but also the Climate Change Fund and the JFPR. And it's really focusing on the needs of older population, and a lot of that has to do with outmigration from the country and the disruption to existing family approaches to care for older people. and productivity. It's also developing new job areas in terms of aged care services, which is also one of the key job areas in the Pacific for migration possibilities. And secondly, the other way in which it's creating jobs is by focusing on caregiver benefits and actually shifting this to paid work. That's an example of the new type of project that's beginning to come. The other thing that's in ADF 14 is this very important window on community development for Afghanistan and Myanmar. I think that this is really a vision of the future as well, not just in terms of this conflict, post-conflict situation, but also in general. It has a focus on two different areas. One is in terms of basic needs, so the social sectors, health, education, social protection, and also climate resilience. And the second one is in terms of livelihoods. And there it's focusing on active labor market programs, skills, and entrepreneurship. This is maybe the piece of glue that we need to really focus on developing more, is the focus on jobs and livelihoods as a part of everything that gets done underneath ADF through every sector that we're working in. But the future priorities, investing in sustaining human capital, investing in community organizations to be able to strengthen that and bring in new forms of working through microfinance and micro-enterprise development, and then a focus on local value chain development. As I said, I think that this really brings us to a window and an opening that we should be trying to push a little bit more, highlighting the social sectors, highlighting resilience building, and the cross-cutting nature of jobs and livelihoods. So thinking then about going forward, what are some of the key places? Sorry. One is in terms of better targeting. We target vulnerable countries. We should be able to target vulnerable communities and groups and people much better, and we're developing the tools for that. The second is this focus on jobs and livelihoods. Third is in terms of leveraging other forms of finance through working through sectors like integrating social development objectives within other sectors like transport, for example, bringing in matching grants, and the strategic use of ADF with blended finance. And finally, one very important area is in terms of partnerships, both regional partnerships for knowledge and understanding of the use of the ADF to be able to spurn some changes in thinking throughout the region and experience. And secondly, co-financing and knowledge partnerships with a range of development partners will be something that really adds focus and coalesces and everybody to really focus on the development objectives within these countries and the sustainability of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. And now may we have Rose Mackenzie share with us her perspectives, particularly from the standpoint of fragile and conflict-affected situations.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much. Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen and colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for this opportunity to contribute to an important discussion and add a little bit of explanation about how ADB engages with FCAS and SIDS, so fragile and conflict-affected situations. I stress the situations, please, not states, situations, and the small island developing states, the SIDS, which many now prefer to refer to as the big ocean states. Now, ADB currently classifies, 12 developing member countries as FCAS, experiencing vulnerability, fragility, and/or conflict. And it also recognizes 16 developing members as SIDS. So the graphic here shows the FCAS economies in yellow, the SIDS in blue, and the intersecting SIDS that are experiencing heightened vulnerability or fragility in green. FCAS classification in ADB is based on the findings of ADB's biennial country performance assessment, and this looks at the quality of policies and institutions, governance and public sector management, and outcomes of concessional assistance. All of these economies share similar but distinct challenges. We'll look a little bit more at those on the next slide. They also share the distinction of standing out in evaluations as economies that are trailing others in development progress across Asia and the Pacific. You'll see on the slide that completed projects in 2021 to 23 rated successful. In FCAS classified developing member countries, this was 40%, down from 52% the previous year. In SIDS, it was 43%, down from 48% the previous year. This is significantly behind the ADB overall average of 68%. This single evaluation metric warrants additional attention for FCAS and SIDS. However, it's not only FCAS and SIDS. We have to remember that fragility is a fluid space. Vulnerability, fragility, and tension, violence, conflict, these are all present or can emerge in other ADB DMCs as well. Sometimes this manifests as a chronic condition of political instability, or perhaps a rapid onset of exogenous factors that lead to economic crisis. Latent tensions at subnational levels can also flare up. All of these instances can spill over into fragility and/or conflict. Vulnerability and fragility come in many different shapes and forms. For this reason, ADB also monitors and responds to other DMCs, developing member countries, that are demonstrating vulnerability or experiencing increased fragility. As I noted, FCAS and SIDS share similar but distinct challenges, and the most common are listed on this slide. As you cast your eye over the bullet points, be aware that each case is unique. The causes and consequences of vulnerability, fragility, and conflict are always context-specific. If we look at the first three bullet points, so instability and security conflict, this can be political, it can be economic, it could be exogenous factors, it could be weak governance, it could be a lack of institutional capacity. Also debt distress, debt unsustainability. These are characteristics of FCAS. They change over time in response to interventions. The next set of challenges we can look at in terms of more structural challenges. These are challenges that do not change over time. We look at, in the case of the SIDS, the structural challenges of remoteness, dispersion over massive ocean territories, the small size of the country and the population. We have to be smarter in how we engage, as these structural constraints are associated with the narrow-based economies that are vulnerable to exogenous shock. The SIDS also face low fiscal revenues and fewer opportunities for effective domestic resource mobilization. They also face an everyday challenge of high import costs, fossil fuel dependency. The bills in some of the SIDS are staggering, and these are affected by exogenous factors. We look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We look at the volatility following that of the international oil markets. The SIDS were hit hard. The final two challenges listed here are common to all fragility and conflict situations and the SIDS. And these have been mentioned by both Permanent Secretary and I think Idi Made as well. We're looking at a lack of human resources and capacity We're looking at outward movement of peoples during periods of instability and conflict. We're also looking at outward movement of people for labor mobility and migration. And this is proving to be a growing opportunity for many of the SIDS, but it comes at a cost to the people who stay behind. Also, increasing exposure, of course, to the impact of natural hazards and climate change. I don't think I need to expand much here. The smaller economies and economies under stress are least able to respond to this existential threat. ADB is working to help our DMCs address these diverse challenges through engagement in the areas listed in the boxes. And again, broadly speaking, they are grouped under yellow for FCAS, developing member countries, blue for the SIDS, and green for the SIDS that are also experiencing heightened fragility. This final slide shows how these engagement areas at a higher level translate down into implementation through ADB's FCAS and SIDS approach, which was approved in 2021. The FSA, FCAS and SIDS approach, recognizes a breadth and scope of challenge. There's no standard approach. Permanent Secretary stole my thunder by using the no one-size-fits-all, and it's true. When engaging in FCAS or SIDS, we need to lay out a series of differentiated approaches that are context-specific and tailored to the needs of these more vulnerable and/or fragile and complex operating environments. The premise of differentiated approaches is that in the highly complex and rapidly evolving environments of FCAS and SIDS, standard ADB processes are not effective. The policy, procedures, and practice applied to interventions in larger, more advanced economies is not appropriate for FCAS and SIDS. Now, we see this in with the differentiated approaches. We see it as a beginning to end approach. We need to look at how we engage with our developing member countries through our country partnership strategies. These need to be longer term. They need to be more deliberatively risk-based planning perspectives. They need to be flexible, yet remain focused on strengthening governance and capacity. We're also adjusting and expanding our business process and policies in the most critical areas of design and implementation: procurement, financial management, capacity development. These need to be relevant and fit for purpose for FCAS and SIDS. Analytics is another area. We need to dive deeper into the causes and consequences of vulnerability, fragility, and conflict to help design better investments and technical assistance. We need to monitor what is happening across the Asia-Pacific region, not just in the formal list of ADB, FCAS classified, and SIDS developing member countries, but in those countries where we see heightened dimensions and factors of risk. M&E, this tends to be more complex and costly in FCAS and SIDS. We also end up with a smaller number of loans and grants to assess and evaluate. This can swing the figures so that they spike or dive rapidly. It's difficult to pick out the trends with certainty. We look forward to working with IED to develop more guidance on undertaking evaluations in FCAS and SIDS. This is certainly one of the work in progress areas. So that leads me to the final point on financing support. Now, the requirements in FCAS and SIDS, it's no exaggeration to say they are very significant. The structural issues, as I mentioned before, are not going to go away. We can learn to mitigate, but we cannot resolve these challenges. FCAS and SIDS need predictability for long-term financing needs, flexibility and space to pilot different approaches, to innovate, to see what will work well and what doesn't work so well. It's worth also mentioning that out of all the countries that we monitor, we have a highly diverse group. We have 8 ADF grant-only countries. We have 3 ADF blend, so 50% concessional lending and 50% grant. We have 2 concessional lending only. And then we have 6 developing member countries that are Group B, so ordinary capital resource blend. We are monitoring at the moment a couple of other DMCs that are experiencing vulnerability, fragility, and conflict, and these are also in Group B. So it's a very broad range of DMCs to address the challenges and the financing needs of. And for that, I think I will hand over to Eric. Yes? Please forgive me.
Thank you, Rose. Eric, please.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to join you. I have a few slides too, if they could come up, but I will try to keep it pretty short so that we can also move to the discussions as well. All right. Now, firstly, on key challenges that the ADF addresses, rather than, which of course mirror in many ways, the key issues that some of these countries face, I will not go over these again because my colleagues have done it all very eloquently. What I would say, however, is that when a shock occurs in small island states and fragile and conflict-affected situations, these can have much longer impacts than they do in other countries. So, for example, I used to live in Fiji during the COVID pandemic. It will take Fiji a generation, if not more, for its public finances to recover from the shock of COVID. The debt levels have increased so significantly in such a small nation that it will take a generation. Similarly, I now live in the Philippines. If we have, say, a disaster that hits the Philippines, the government of the Philippines is much more likely to be able to deal comprehensively with that disaster because it is a very large country with a very broad economic base and lots of infrastructure and people that would not be so directly impacted. If you're a small state, one cyclone can wipe out all your infrastructure. There is simply nothing left to rebuild from. That means that some of these challenges are going to be incredibly hard to overcome because every country is always only a shock or a disaster away from starting again. Looking at ADF 14, so we have just finished the negotiations for the Asian Development Fund 14. It will cover the period 2025 to 2028. It was actually approved by our board just last Thursday, so thank you to the directors also for their support. What I want to stress here is that ADF has evolved, and we've been able to evolve in part actually thanks to the important evaluations by IED. ADF has existed for 50 years, and for much of that time, ADF focused on providing country allocations, so a specific allocation of money to a country, and they were given an amount, and essentially we would program those resources. And the idea was, we will give this to the poorest and most vulnerable countries that currently are not able to borrow from ADB on commercial terms. And then we're going to do such a great job with socio-economic development, economic growth, that in the future they will be able to borrow. And over time, in fact, we won't even need an Asian Development Fund anymore, and we can all go home. Well, isn't that wonderful? Except it hasn't quite panned out that way. What we now find is we have a subset of countries, small island states, fragile economies, that have an incredibly uncertain development pathway. Some of the SIDS may never be able to borrow on commercial terms. Their public finances may never be strong enough. In fact, I don't think that, that I will outlive the ADF. It will exist long after me. So with that, we've had a shift away from just providing country allocations to the poorest and most vulnerable countries to some of the other things here on the screen. So firstly, supporting thematic priorities. This is very new in ADF. We've only done this for 2 cycles. So rather than just allocating money to the poorest and most vulnerable countries, we take a broader approach of looking at which countries need grants, and we may come back to this also in the questions, but to incentivize them to undertake investments in climate adaptation, in regional public goods, in gender equality. The next component we built on is where it mentions countries in crisis. So this can refer to sudden onset crises, such as a natural disaster or a pandemic, for example. But it also includes situations like what we now see in Afghanistan and in Myanmar, where the ADF has been able to channel quite significant funding in the hundreds of millions of dollars through UN agencies and international NGOs to deal with the more acute needs in the crisis situations there. And lastly, I just wanted to highlight, again, this issue around capacity and facilitating knowledge transfer and how this is really, well, a growing area of importance for ADB. In ADF 14, just to give you, I hope, some good news, we've just finished the replenishment, so we will have $5 billion in grants available in the next 4 years. That is an increase of 21% compared to the previous 4-year period, which we think is a great result given that many countries face fiscal pressures at home. It is a strong partnership between donors and ADB. ADF donors, which includes the People's Republic of China, and probably every country pretty much represented in this room, their contributions amount to about $2.6 billion, and then ADB puts in $1.6 billion from our profits, and then there are some other sources coming in as well. Now, importantly, this is the largest ever volume of grants in our 50-year history that we've been able to mobilize. So really, we see this as rising to some of the challenges. And my last point here is it doesn't just stop at the grants. We also, as some of my colleagues mentioned, provide concessional loans. And in fact, the replenishment allows us to provide $8 of concessional finance for every $1 in donor commitment. So a tremendous leverage ratio we see there. I won't go through this slide in detail, but these are just for your reference. These are the different components that we have in ADF 14. Just to highlight, in country allocation, so we have strengthened the performance incentives for countries that essentially to have incentives to have well-functioning portfolios and to take important steps on their public finances and their safeguard systems and so forth. We have grown significantly the thematic priorities, as has already been mentioned. And again, we have a very significant now new window for the people of Afghanistan and Myanmar with more than $1.1 billion in financing over the next 4 years. And importantly, we discussed a little bit about a results framework for ADF. It was mentioned. That will look at, of course, the impact of ADB operations, the efficiency of ADB operations, but ultimately, we also think it is important to start with where the dollars go, because the question is sometimes whether the poorest and most vulnerable countries are in fact less able to utilize those resources and to apply for those resources than others. So what we have now in the current round of ADF is for the first time we have a target that at least 32.5% of all Asian Development Fund grants will go to small island states, at least 40% will go to FCAS, and at least 45% will go on climate. So we have with that a very strong commitment. And if you look at, for example, the SIDS, in reality, we expect this to mean that the available financing for SIDS in a 4-year period will increase from about $900 million to about $1.4 billion. So an increase of about 50% in resources over 4 years. Let me pause there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. And thanks to the rest of the panel for such deep insights and varied perspectives on ADF. So now we move towards our discussion blocks. In the interest of time, we won't be able to divide this discussion block anymore into 2 different segments. So what I'll do is I'll just ask our panelists questions directly and without specifically focusing on either of the discussion blocks. So let me start with Executive Director Maddie. Given the intersecting challenges that you've mentioned as well, and as we heard from the rest of the panel, I wanted to ask you, how can ADF strengthen partnerships with other multilateral development banks as well as development partners so that we can maximize the impact of concessional financing, particularly in small island developing states?
Yeah, thank you, Ness. I think since now we already identify and also recognizing what the key challenges and also what the problem facing for the seed especially. So from my views and my observations so far, at least if we want to strengthen the partnership and also how to maximizing the role of the ADF grants, I can share the idea. At least there are five things we can consider, because what our observation until now, what the current policies and also what the new initiative policy proposing by the management and discussed to the board. So I think the first one we have to consider to strengthen the partnership is how we improve our coordination and co-financing. I think this is very important for SEED, since as Eric mentioned, the allocation so far is very small, while now we have committed to give more attention and more allocation. I think it's good, and also how can we invite also other MDBs and our international development partners to joining to finance the SEED program and also the project. The second one is also good as a consideration, how we can synchronize and harmonizing the action plan. So this is my view is since now, let's say for the climate change, last year we are in ADB already endorsed the climate change action plan during the COP28 in Dubai. So I think it's a good start how we try to strengthen the partnership with the other MDBs, since they have also the same concern how tackling the climate issues. It should be, my view is once we have the climate action, the other MDBs should be not duplicate or not overlaps. It should be complement what the other plan. So this is the way how we maximizing the impact. And also the other thing is since now the management also proposed to the board in ADB to promote a full mutual reliance framework. I think it's a good approach when we can support the SEED for the ADF grants, when they have a proposal for some project. Once we agree to co-finance, and then we decide who's the leader. So we agree the leader, let's say ADB leader, so that means all the regulation, all the arrangements will be following the ADB regulation. So for the procurement, the safeguards should be following the ADBs. Otherwise, or let's say the World Bank as the leader, so all arrangements will be following the World Bank, the procurement, and also the safeguard and the others. And the other thing also, how we should we keep the sustainability of the reforms, because sometimes when we support the SEED, once the project completed and then done, so we don't know what the follow-up. So I think in terms of the reforms, we have to monitor the sustainability, even the projects that are completed, and also the support for the SEED is already done. So it is good for us to to maintain the sustainability of the reform still in the seeds. And the last one, I think, as also mentioned by the colleague, how we can improve the capacity building. But again, when we support this seed to improve the capacity, we have to consider also the differentiated approach, because since they have very unique challenges, a very unique characteristics, should be we considering what the seed needs and also food for purpose, because sometimes we have a project development in the seed. We try to introduce new methodology, but I think sometimes it's not fit with the seed characteristic. Thank you, Nash. I stop here.
Thank you, Edie Madi. And I think that's a very good point you raised about synchronizing and harmonizing responses amongst development partners and multilateral development banks working in countries such as small island developing states. Now, speaking of impact, I'd just like to go to Eric and ask you, how would you define the success of ADF's concessional financing in the last decade? What metrics would you be using? And if you have any successful examples that you could share with us.
Thank you, Nash. That's a tricky question. Let me start with, I'm actually going to quote your Director General, Manny, who we all heard from this morning, who said in the evaluation that ADF has been instrumental in advancing the region's development amid multiple crises. So as a starting point, that gives us some great comfort that the evaluation found this, of course. I would say firstly that there's a few factors that influence ADF's success in the region. The first is that ADF has really become an important platform for donor coordination. So what we see is that many of the donors in the region channel their resources through the ADF now being the second largest source of development finance in the region. And with that, we are able to better structure our support to be long-term, as Rose said, and not to go through too many different individual programs and projects. I think when it comes to some of these structural issues, really size does matter when it comes to some of these issues. Secondly, I think one of the great successes has been our evolving role, and this goes back to this point that we used to do country allocations. We now respond to thematic priorities, countries in crisis, and so forth. But at the same time, I do want to acknowledge that ADF operates, of course, in a very tough operating environment. With that, as Rose also put up, it shows that the percentage of ADF operations rated successful, particularly in FCAS and in SIDS, is lower than it is in other countries. With that, I think we need to, again, we need to look at project design, project readiness, how we can supplement the capacity of countries to deliver. We are now, for example, in the SIDS, we are working increasingly on supporting them with contract supervision and project management. One thing I would say, and this goes a bit deeper into the metrics of the evaluations, but I do see that, well, there has been a, let's say, a downward trend in some of the performance. I do like to think that that is partly because we're getting tougher, and not necessarily because we're getting worse, which is perhaps a positive way of looking at it. But also I would say that in many cases, what brings down the success rates of ADF projects is things like delays in procurement and delays in implementation compared to original timelines. But that just shows that the original timelines were rubbish to begin with, which unfortunately in many cases they were. It doesn't show that the ultimate resulting infrastructure is not good infrastructure. It just shows an issue with the design. And unfortunately, we are dealing with that and addressing it. But I would also say that those rates that you saw on the screen, this is my final point, those were projects that were evaluated in the last 3, 4, 5 years. Those were projects that were designed and started 10 plus years ago. There is an enormous lag when we look at these results, and I certainly expect and hope that those results will start turning around and looking a lot more positive in the years to come. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. I think that's a very good point about success rates, especially operating in very challenging circumstances. Now I turn to Deputy Secretary. Just wanted to get your thoughts on the strategies that can be implemented to align the efforts of ADF with national development priorities in the Pacific, particularly in Tuvalu, and how can we strengthen regional cooperation to address the various challenges that we've discussed earlier as well.
Thank you, Nassreena. Yeah. Well, in terms of the strategy that will be able to align our development plan as well as the ADB, what I have is just a more specific country-based approach where each country is able to approach, to bring up to ADB what sort of challenges based on the needs assessments that can be conducted uniquely for each Pacific Island countries. This, I understand, will be able, will enable each developing countries to raise their concern and for ADB specifically to address them on the specific country by country basis. Well, in terms of strengthening regional cooperation within the Pacific, I know that most of us Pacific Island countries, we are also facing similar challenges, especially with the climate change issues. Noting that for us in the Pacific, we are only focusing on adaptation strategies because we do not emit that much, especially for our small island Pacific. So it's a good strategy to work together collaboratively with our Pacific Island countries who share the same challenges and probably to learn the lessons from each of them. Lastly, I highlight one of the director chair in his speech during the opening session. He mentioned that although the road is far, if we keep walking together, we will reach our final destination. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary. That's a very apt quote that you've shared with us. Now I turn to Wendy. I just wanted to note that you gave some very important points earlier on strengthening ADF's thematic pool, particularly the use of the thematic pool, looking at social protection and social development. How do you think can ADF ensure that concessional finance, particularly grants, can prioritize the needs of the most marginalized communities among Group A countries and some Group B countries through the thematic pool? Also looking at how can we make ADF more inclusive, particularly ensuring that marginalized and vulnerable populations benefit equally.
I think in evaluation you have this term, what we measure is what matters, right? So what we incentivize is also what matters and where people will move to. So I think that that's maybe one of my big points is incentivizing does make a difference, and the thematic pools are good. We need to adapt it to be stronger, or we need to think about how to strengthen and add to that with a few other dimensions to really be able to focus in well. That kind of support for health, education, social protection, system strengthening, program development is as much a part of the infrastructure, of the social infrastructure to go in parallel with the physical infrastructure to really build the resilience for the future. Right now, just a couple of the challenges are that Some of the thematic pool guidelines have become a little bit more rigid, and that makes it more difficult for these social sectors to be able to tap into it, specifically the one on climate adaptation. Probably as we move forward, everybody will be trying to think about that a little bit more, but they are really important impediments to the uptake and use. And nothing could be more important on the adaptation side than the social, social protection systems, for one, especially adaptive and shock responsive, has to be a part of the overarching approach. The second is that even for the gender window, that is limited. The time for doing these applications comes pretty not so regularly, and it's getting utilized very quickly so that projects that come a little bit later down the line don't have access to that. That's an unfair disadvantage, just depending on where you are in the calendar. And finally, within ADB, we don't really have any dedicated partnered trust funds to address sectors other than the Japan Fund for Poverty Reduction, which even those windows have shifted away from social sectors specifically within it. So you see this narrowing of the possibilities for access to finance when it is so important. As you said, the recovery from COVID is not just physical, it's also in terms of the poverty shock, and this is also going to take a long time, and new strategies need to be developed. So all of those things working together. I talked about the importance of targeting, and you can only do that if you have the systems and the data to be able to do that. So within ADB, we have been trying to improve our own approach and methodology to poverty and social analysis to be able to have a better understanding at both the country and the project level about who are the vulnerable and most vulnerable groups and communities, and how to be able to design for reaching them better. And I think that will make a difference, and it's then captured and articulated in our new corporate results framework, a specific indicator on poverty and inclusion, which I think could also be part of the thinking behind ADF going forward, that projects have to be able to meet that criteria to be able to be eligible, if you want to look for a way of targeting beyond the country level. So how to prioritize the needs is really to rethink some of these ways in which the ADF is allocated, and to focus on this issue of timing versus focus. I have some other comments on particularly vulnerable groups if you come around. Thanks.
So please go ahead. I know you. It would be interesting as well to hear from you in terms of vulnerable groups, particularly. How can ADF support, the youth, for example, and those with aging populations?
Yeah, well, I think you highlighted those two specific examples. So I tried to include one in the presentation about the kinds of projects that are being developed around aging population and how that is linked not just to services and service delivery and quality, but also to job creation and also to enhanced community engagement, and all the reasons that Rose just raised about social stability and stuff. This is really at the heart of that. I think that the feedback from people on our regional teams is that countries are willing to utilize the ADF for youth and aged care projects, or projects focused on different vulnerable groups. And they want to, the experience is that they're often using it to be bold and include innovative and transformative design features which go across the different thematic portals. But we really lack the same grants and leverage to focus on issues about inclusion and equity. And so again, I say, Eric, please, if we can do something on that. And the evidence is so clear that when given the opportunity to add a little bit more, it makes a big difference. There's a project in Vanuatu on supporting the delivery of skills, a development project, and they started with 4 million as the ADF grant allocation. But then they got the thematic pool gender side, which added an additional 10 million, and that's what we're seeing. And so that enabled them to do a lot of gender responsive infrastructure, curriculum development, childcare qualifications, all kinds of things, and professional development. And when they were able to add on a JFPR, it allowed them then to focus on constructing a model disability classroom, providing assistive devices. I mean, it just adds and adds and adds. But I'll say all of that is possible, but it is a lot of work. So if we had the opening from the beginning, then you could think about that without having to go through all these hoops and jumps at the same time, and really put that inclusion up front would make I think will help to drive a change. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. And I think your point about what we incentivize matters is really well taken. Now let me move on to Rose. You mentioned some important challenges as well during your presentation. I thought that was very comprehensive. I wanted to ask you, what is the importance of capacity building in FCAS and SIDS in the future strategy that we have for concessional finance, and how should we be prioritizing this?
Thank you very much, Nash. We cannot overstate the importance of capacity development in FCAS and SIDS. Given the issues, the realities of structural vulnerabilities and fragilities of small populations, given the movements of people who in times of crisis or conflict will tend to cross borders and possibly not come back, given increasing labor mobility, as I mentioned before, we need to look at different models. Now, this is a big ask, but it's a very, very important step. If we are to make sure that ADF 14 and successive ADF packages work and have positive development outcomes, we really need to look longer term. First of all, I'll come back to longer term, because first of all, I want to talk about in-country and in-region capacity. We need to move away comprehensively from the fly-in, fly-out support that is provided and has been offered for so many years to FCAS and SIDS developing member countries. This benefits some, but it does not, at the end of the day, benefit the country themselves. We need a long-term investment to build that in-country capacity. Long-term needs to be pragmatic approaches. We need to go beyond the project cycles. We need to look not only in terms of 5-year or even 10-year projects. We need the visioning that will take us through generations of capacity, starting with school, starting with primary schools, secondary schools, tertiary education, looking further into the needs of government, the needs for learning and skills building in the private sector. None of us today have talked about the private sector, and this could fill a whole panel all by itself. So the capacity is key. No one organization or development partner can do this themselves. We need to collaborate. Edie Made, your words were very well heard. One point that I'd like to really stress is the need to invest more in deep dive assessments of the whole capacity or capability ecosystems, so that we really can provide support. We can be sure that we're providing support where support is most needed. For example, ADB projects work with executing agencies and implementing agencies, and they provide capacity development to these entities. But how about at sector level, the steering committees or equivalent that work across the elements of the ADB team, the implementing agency entities, and the consultant teams? These steering committees themselves, at a sectoral level, often need capacity development and investment. When we can do that at a higher level than just individual projects, we're going to get a bigger buck in return investment. That's for sure. It's going to ensure that the knowledge, the experience, and the positive outcomes are in that sector will be sustainable. It's not just one project after one project. So yes, this would necessitate a different funding mechanism. So beyond individual projects, everybody looks at Eric when we talk about financing and funding. But it really would go a very long way in eking out that concessional financing. Nash, I'm aware of the time, and you probably want to open up to the floor, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Rose. I have a ton of questions to ask our panelists, but because of time constraints, I don't think that's possible. But just one last quick question for Eric. In the context of all these challenges that we've just discussed, what innovative approaches do you think should concessional finance, particularly ADF, should adopt to remain effective in the future?
Thanks, Nash. I think really what we need to do is, first of all, is to, it goes back, I think, to evaluation. I think that I do want to stress that I don't think enough evaluation of ADF projects has taken place, including impact evaluation work that I think needs to be undertaken. And I think this is something that we're looking to do more and more of. Right. We do now, for example, have, particularly on projects in gender equality, we now have a requirement that impact evaluation be undertaken for every project that receives thematic grants for this, which I think is an important step away from the from the past practices, let's say. I also think that when it comes to innovative approaches, it's looking at financing. That's mostly what I do. I think we also need to recognize that, you know, I am pretty happy about a $5 billion replenishment, but it's a drop in the bucket in terms of what is actually needed in the region to address all the challenges that we have. So we need to look at the other climate funds and how we can leverage their resources, the other MDBs. Rose just mentioned the private sector. It is difficult to work with the private sector and to incentivize them to invest in things like regional public goods, but we have to try, and there are models out there that we can copy. And then my last point, perhaps in terms of innovation, would be just that there is an opportunity in many of our countries to leapfrog some of the investments that perhaps have been made elsewhere. So that means digitization. That means when it comes to things like renewable energy generation, looking at floating solar and co-benefits of solar and agriculture and these kind of things, we need to not just look at what was done in many developed countries 5 or 10 years ago. We need to really see at how our concessional assistance recipients can be at the cutting edge of technological innovation. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Eric. As a fan of impact evaluations, I'm very, very happy to hear that ADF is going to be taking in more of these impact evaluations as well, particularly for the thematic windows. Now we have a few minutes to open the floor for any questions or comments from our audience today. And so if you could just raise your hand and head over to the microphones that we have in the middle of the room. Please do introduce yourself for a bit, and if possible, if you could make your question as concise as possible. All right, so I think we have, yes, please.
I supervise the division that deals with all the ADB projects. So I'm particularly keen to learn. So we're talking about capacity building. I'm also learning a lot today. My question is for Wendy, although Wendy, I think you clarified that also while giving certain examples. So when you were talking about the matching grants, I just wanted to know how do countries then qualify for those grants? What would be the criteria? For example, you were talking about a project in Vanuatu. So for example, if a country is already cash strapped, and then, how do they come up with a project which will then qualify for your matching grant? Thank you.
Thank you. A couple of the sources of funding I talked about are the way that you come to it is really in discussion with the team and the team leader. There's the Japan Fund for Poverty Reduction. I think it changed its name. Sorry, I'm saying the old name, but nonetheless still the same. That is, that's a grant that's often used for a very good technical assistance or capacity building, and that's an opportunity open to any country. It doesn't have to be just ADF focused. We have a new fund also with the climate change team and also the gender and ourselves and social development on Community Resilience Partnership Program. That currently has about 9 countries, but it's going to expand substantially. Pakistan is eligible for it. This is really to focus on community-based adaptation and resilience. It has a special window on women. It also has a special window on special focus on adaptive and shock-responsive social protection. So I think that these are discussions that really come out of the working closely with the teams to look at what are the needs and identifying these additional sources. Thanks.
I may just supplement also. So in the case of Pakistan, Pakistan is in our case what we term a Group B country. So that means it has access to concessional loans as well as regular loans. Now, there was a comment from IED that there was, essentially it came down to not enough grant money available to Group B countries in order to support and incentivize these investments in particularly regional public goods. I completely agree. In ADF's case, we have about doubled the support that is available to Group B countries for such thematic grants to about $150 million over 4 years. But it is still not nearly enough. Frankly, this came down to a negotiation with donors about respective priorities. It's very difficult to juggle the needs of the people in Afghanistan versus the needs in the SIDS and the needs in other countries to do, say, climate adaptation investments. It's a balancing act. But I think it's more generally this issue of concessionality for particularly regional and global public goods is an area where ADF and the existing trust funds play a role, but there's much more to be said about that, about what the MDBs are doing. And this is a very active point of discussion amongst the MDBs at the moment.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Oh, please go ahead.
So I'll be very quick. I realize we're about 3 minutes away. It's super helpful. Wendy, absolutely shocking that the numbers are so low for on the human development side. I mean, that figure is stunning to me. My name is Chris Nelson from the World Bank. I'm responsible for completion reporting in the Independent Evaluation Group. And it's just, yeah, it's amazing. When I look at IDA funding at the World Bank, which is the equivalent, much, much higher. And so it would be interesting to kind of look at the comparisons there and what are the drivers behind that. But I want to kind of zero into a quick question for Eric. So, interestingly, we don't do an evaluation of the IDA cycle. I wonder if, as an evaluator, the last thing we want to do is to say we shouldn't be doing it all the time, but I wonder if you have a thought on whether it makes sense to continue to undertake an evaluation of the fund rather than actually looking at something systematic, which is actually drawing upon the multiple sources of evaluation that already exist to kind of do something that's a little less weighty, but to maybe zero in on a couple of things that really stand out as a limitation of the fund. I don't know that I share with you the optimism that you talk about in terms of results, in terms of going forward. I think you will find that, you know, it will be ebbs and flows the same as it has been for a very long time. And if anything, the challenges, particularly for SIDS, is much, much greater than they have been previously. And that's where the creativity part comes in. It's just, again, I know the questions about evaluation, but also whether you have this idea of whether we're looking creatively enough at how to think about the human development side in regards to its climate change allocation, how education fits in, and how we respond to some of the SIDS members of the panel who are talking about the lack of skills in regards to particularly construction and infrastructure. That, for me, seems a really obvious entry point. Anyway, over to you.
One quick comment. So in terms of the evaluation of ADF, I think what we found to be the most useful is that we do see that ADF has evolved very rapidly in terms of the different components that we have and how funds are allocated. And I think what we try to do is really to work with IED to see how those the processes and the criteria and the targeting of the assistance, how we can make that more effective. So that's perhaps a slightly different story than the outcome and impact evaluation that is also sorely needed, but where in the past we have perhaps connected it more together with what ADB has done at a country level or actually as a whole of bank level. So we haven't necessarily done that as closely for the ADF, but I think there we've been able to really demonstrate over the last few cycles that IED and its recommendations that we have been able to work together to implement those and to actually to lead to a more robust resource allocation framework. Thanks.
Thank you for that question. And just to add as well, from IED side, we want to make sure that the evaluations are actually very useful, and we have come across that question as well, given that for IDA, it's not necessarily the case that it's being evaluated for every cycle. But one of the things that we have considered as well is how useful is it for ADB management to be able to learn and gather lessons from the evaluation, and also equally important is being able to address some of the questions from ADB's board and ADF donors. These are the people that also have high demand for these evaluations, and we want to make sure that we are responsive as well. So I think that concludes this panel session. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to our panelists for such great perspectives and insights. I really appreciate your presence today, especially after lunch. I'm sure that was a little bit hard for some of you, but I hope you had some coffee. We now have, I think, coffee as well offered outside, so please do have that. Thank you again, and have a great the rest of the session.
Please don't forget to scan the QR codes at your table to give us feedback on how we could improve your next AEW experience. Thank you.